I was thinking earlier, after listening to the distinguished speakers earlier, people talking about Neil and his transformations, and ladies with lovely books about relationships. I thought, what did they put Adam and I together for? And then I thought, it's because we see dead people. There's one thing I would like to say before I start talking about the book. I'd like to talk about you folks for just a second. This is my first novel. This is a whole new experience for me. The book has been fortunate enough to win a few awards, and it won award thing which I did not think in any form or fashion I would win. I had to go running across this ballroom in a New York hotel to pick up the award, and I had no idea what I was going to say, and I simply grabbed the award and held it up, and it said, this is for middle-aged men who take up writing as their midlife crisis instead of fast cars and 20-year-old women. And I would like to think that writing a book is not as expensive as divorce, but I'm not quite sure it's come to that point yet. But as part of this process, I've had an opportunity to go to a lot of different places and speak to a lot of different people. And one of the really rewarding things that I've discovered is that libraries in this country are vital, surviving and thriving in these tough times. And to Linda and all the people at this library and all of you who come and support this group here, congratulations to you guys for making this very important part of the community viable and successful. So please give yourselves a hand if you would. Dead Weight is based on a true story, and it's not very often that an author would be able to stand up, an author of a fictional novel, stand up and say there's a headline to the story. But in this case, there is kind of a headline to this story. After I had written the book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. It is based on a young man, 1910 Charleston. I'll give you the plot line really quick because it's so amusing. 1910 Charleston, there's the story of there was a murder, there was a trial, an execution, and a hurricane. And those are the true elements of the story. In this case, the young man who was arrested, tried and executed, and I'll leave it to you, general readers, to draw your own conclusions. But he was, in my opinion, innocent. He was about to be married. There was no motive, no reason why he should do this. He was actually going to pick up his wedding suit on the day that he was arrested. And I wrote the book, and I went back and I was doing my read-through edit, and I got to the end of it, and I was somewhat saddened that this young man's life had been taken from him, that he never had a chance to marry, to have children, to have all the joys that we've had at this point in our lives. And I thought, well, what can I do? I've written the story and it's ended here. So I decided to file a request for a posthumous pardon in the state of South Carolina to see, because believe me, I'm not particularly religious. As a matter of fact, I've run away from 3 or 4 religions at this point in my life. But I do believe in the continuity of souls. And I do think that if we were successful in gaining a pardon for this young man, somewhere that he would know and somehow it would make a difference. Well, the first thing suggests it wouldn't be an easy process. We called the South Carolina Pardon and Parole Board because that's how you do it in South Carolina. The governor himself can't really just stroke out a pardon. In the first call to the Pardon and Parole Board, we had to explain to them what posthumous meant, which, yeah, this is kind of my reaction too. So, thinking this could be a tough uphill battle. And the second thing that really did not give me a great deal of hope, I sent the governor of our state at that time a letter requesting this, suggesting that even if it weren't a matter of justice, it might perhaps be a matter of mercy. Our governor at that time, Governor Sanford, I don't know if you follow politics, had just gotten off the Appalachian Trail. He had interests that were a little bit more personal than a man who'd been dead 100 years. So we never really heard from the governor. So the headline of the story was 2 weeks ago. I went to Columbia. This middle-aged white man in a suit that I hoped I'd retired to see the Pardon and Parole Board. I went in there with a very distinguished Charleston attorney. And a distinguished Charleston attorney, I think it might be more distinguished in some ways than attorneys other places, because they could just kind of, the folks in Charleston have this kind of air about them. Or arrogance, I'm not entirely sure which. Perhaps more arrogance than air. And two of us, there was a state senator, who's also the pastor of the largest black church in Charleston, a man of exceptional grace, employs. And also, there was a young woman who was a fourth generation daughter of the Reverend who actually attended the character Neely Duncan in his jail cell before execution. She called me when she heard about this and said, I want to be there. For 4 generations in my family, this story has been legend and legacy of innocence of this young man, and I want to tell that story to the Pardon and Parole Board. She brought with her 10-year-old daughter, hoping that by the 5th generation, the state of South Carolina would get it right. They didn't. The request was denied 2 weeks ago, so we go onward. Someone had asked me if I can refile, and I was kind of wondering just to let it go for a while, see what I would do. And I was thinking about just letting it drop, but I read, Elizabeth said this morning, she didn't pay any attention to things that are written about her books, either reviews or otherwise. I don't have that strength. Read something in the newspaper, a descendant of the man who was murdered, who had written a letter to the Pardon and Parole Board, told the press that he thought that my motivation in doing it was to sell books and to get movie rights. Wow. If he saw my account ledger, he would know that I wasn't making any money on this book. And it annoyed me enough that I've decided I'll probably go ahead and refile for the pardon, just because there's something about the Humphreys family that is deeply rooted in stubbornness. So I think that will happen. The story itself, again, is based on a true story. So you have this core of a murder, trial, execution, hurricane. One of the things that really resonated with the story for me when I first read the research on it, and another fellow had compiled this research, was the hurricane. 100 years after this true event, that hurricane is still remembered as the Duncan Storm, as retribution on Charleston for hanging an innocent man. That resonated with me, that it lasted 100 years after that. The other thing about the story that really resonated with me was the young man himself. This young man is 23 years old. He's about to be married. Instead of marriage, he's hanged. Man, you get it wrong in front of librarians and you just, that is, wow. Instead, he's hanged. In fact, and in the book, I've put in a portion of a letter that he wrote that he delivered as he was going to be executed, in which he forgave those who gave false testimony against him. He thanked his jailers for their kind treatment and said, I'm at peace, I'm an innocent man, I'll see you all in heaven. It's just me, folks. If I'm about to be hanged the next morning, I'm not going to write some nice note like that and hand it off. The young man's extreme sense of grace really struck me. And that's why I felt that the book needed to be written. I wrote it as fiction. It was a very different process for me, and I was very fortunate in many ways in this author process. This publisher, a small publisher in Charleston, brought the story to me. Why she thought I had any wisdom, I don't know. And asked what I thought should be done with it. And I read through the research, and I thought, well, I really think it should be written as fiction so that you can create some characters. You can use Charleston as almost a set piece. And perhaps raise the story up a little bit more, make it a little more interesting. And I was thinking about other models or other people who may or may not have done something similar, because obviously you want it to be successful. And I thought about someone else, another fellow who had written a book that was based on a murder, a trial, a small southern town. And I thought John Brandt did a pretty doggone good job with Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. So I thought about that. Plus, John Brandt has a villa in Tuscany, and I've got, a small 40-acre farm just north of Charleston. So he obviously has done a lot better than I have. But I thought in using fiction, it would help raise the story to another level. And we did that. The thing is, everything about books, it's all about the pitch. It's all about the sell. And how do you distill a story of this? You're going to tell someone, I'm writing this book about a murder, a trial, and execution, 1910, young black man. In essence, you've got the story of a Jim Crow lynching, judicial lynching. Well, that just doesn't zing very much, does it? I'm Southern, my family's Southern, I grew up, many generations have been here. Unfortunately, folks, it's not that hard to find cases of Jim Crow lynchings in the South. But one thing that I wanted to do in telling the story as fiction and using these characters was be able to expand it enough so that you could put perspective on the time. I thought that was very important because otherwise, just to wholly condemn it and paint it in one broad stroke as a judicial lynching, I don't think would do Charleston or the time period any good. So, writing as fiction allows you to do a number of different things. It's fun writing fiction. I spent my whole life as a journalist, and I worked at CBS News, and the whole thing, the whole of my life was following the facts. That was a favorite phrase of an old man called Dan Rather. So you follow the facts the whole of my life. I start writing this book, and I have a true story in front of me, which gives me a straight line. It gives me something to work. I'm using fiction to weave in and out of the story. The most fun as a writer, after coming out of journalism for 25 years, is to be able to write fiction because I can do whatever I want to the people. I can make them fall in love. I can kill them, which I do several, and it's a great deal of fun killing people in your book. And you can, it's just free license to have fun in creating characters, in making up the people that you want to, in using this town called Charleston, which is a very interesting little place. It's truly one of America's most beautiful and crazy cities. Just a wealth of characters there. So in going down that fictional line, after so long in doing bringing it to this point, there's such a free rein to make the characters that you think are going to work. If you're telling a story like this, it at least helped me to create characters that brought some levity to it. And I also put romance in it. I thought that there was one very true romantic line. The young man who was tried and executed was about to be married. There's a fictional romantic line between this reporter from New York who comes to Charleston. And I'd gotten an email from a woman who'd read the book right after it came out and said, I enjoyed the 3 romantic lines that you created in your book. And I went, well, that's funny. I wrote the book, but I only recall 2 of them. And I had to send her an email back and say, what was the 3rd romantic line? And she said it was obviously your love of Charleston. Yeah, I kind of went, too. And it was, it is a marvelous place. I'll read one very short paragraph, which I think is probably where this came from, of what Charleston and scene and setting can do, I think, to help use it as a set piece. I crossed the border between black and white, re-entering the streets with gaslights and sidewalks. Here, a softer glow painted these homes in perfect splendor. From behind high walls topped with spiked bars and embraced by vines, tall windows released rays that made their way to the street. Walking past Charleston's homes, you could feel the barrier that separated them from us being those not tied to bloodlines reaching back to the birth of the nation. It's a defining line of class, a stark separation that seems out of step for this city. In this light, she was seductive, a little worn perhaps, a bit past her prime, but still radiating a tangible heat that made you want to fall into her arms. And that scene, actually, when that was pointed out to me, that was actually a scene of a young man in his early 20s, the first time I visited Charleston, wandering around at midnight. What I was doing wandering around at midnight, I won't tell you right now, but it's the kind of city that you can actually lose yourself in. So the process of a first-time author is at middle age. You have far to go to hit that. To put a book out there puts you in a very vulnerable place. I thought after being in network news in New York for 15 years that I had fairly thick skin. Well, you just don't know how vulnerable you are until you're an author at middle age and you're looking at people. Almost everyone you come across, did you like my book? Did you really like my book? Yeah. It's your Sally Field moment played over and over again, kind of like Groundhog Day. And that's what it is. You do these things, you go on the road, you speak to people, and I really and truly believe that sometimes writing the book is the easy part. Because if there's not some passion in you, if you don't have some feel about what you've put on the page, and you can't go out and talk to people about it, then you might as well stay on the couch. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you meet people and you talk about your book, and you either love it or you don't. I'll tell you one very short story about how Neil talked earlier about his such a lovely book, and Neil is a lovely man, about the transformation that he went through in his life. Now, I've gone through a similar transformation in becoming an author at middle age. When you go on the road, it's amazing the sense of humility you learn when you drive for hours and show up at an event and no one comes to buy your book. I went one very hot day, it was the end of summer, I believe, to a mall in a small town I won't mention, Orangeburg, South Carolina. Which, if you have never been there, let me recommend it. It's not worth it. And I went into this mall. It was a small independent bookstore, and when you're a first-time author, if they will have you, you will go. You do not say no. So I did a little recon. I like to do recons when I go to stores. So I walked past it, and I turned around and walked back, and in this mall, they were having this little health fair, and it was the tail end of this little group of slightly overweight girls in little sequin suits doing this little dance number, and you kind of look at them and you wonder, why does your mother dress you like a little whore? And then they left, and this music starts up, and this rather somewhat large guy in a cape goes running out, and he starts singing Elvis songs, and I've come out right at the beginning of an Elvis impersonator doing karaoke in the middle of the mall. And it's one of those cathartic moments when I look up in the air and I was like, I survived 15 years in network news in New York, and here I am in a mall in Orangeburg, South Carolina, following an Elvis impersonator and not selling any books. So his little show was over, and I saw Elvis walking through the mall. I hadn't sold any books, so I got up from my chair, and I went running through the mall, and I grabbed Elvis by the elbow and said, if I can listen to you sing for 15 minutes, you can buy one of my books. And Elvis bought one of my books. Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you. Questions, please. I don't know if you can ask Adam who done it or how it happened, or he won't give away the punchline. You've got to buy the book first. Any questions?
This is for Adam.
Yes, ma'am.
What happened to your cousin's husband, if anything?
The question was, what happened to my cousin's husband? He approached my great uncle, who was a very successful builder in Los Angeles, for some money. And my great uncle said, much less pleasantly, no. And the guy disappeared into the woodwork. I mean, it was very obvious that he killed her. And so, I mean, I really like what Batt said about, continuity of souls. I mean, just in the same way in Mr. Peanut, I felt very compelled as I was researching the Shepard case not to resolve the question of who killed Marilyn Shepard, or on a macro level, who killed Alice Pepin. I think it was only respectful not to resolve it, because the book is about failure and redemption in marriage. And so that's really couple to couple the great mystery, how to succeed. Yes? Yes, ma'am?
What are each of you reading now?
I am doing some research on a second book, and the funny thing about writing historical fiction, which this next one will be as well, it's kind of the journalist thing. I get to go back and I get to play with history and tease out different parts of it. One of the characters in this next book is going to be modeled after, it's set in World War II, the marvelous war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was just a brilliant, brilliant man, and one of his dispatches is one of the most brilliant pieces of war journalism I've ever read, and it still gives me chills and tears every time I read it. So I've been reading Ernie Pyle lately.
I am about to go to Perth, Australia for the Perth Writers Festival. And so I'm reading The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, which is about the founding of the Australian penal colony. And I can only tell you all, if you haven't read it, it is, it's amazing. I mean, it just is, because it's about basically, at the end of the 18th century, it's about the attempt by Imperial England to create a dystopia tens of thousands of miles away by taking their whole criminal class and shipping them to the other side of the world. And read it. It's unbelievable. I'm reading lots of other things too, but that's something. Yes, ma'am?
I've heard a lot today about 12 years for the first novel, and a lot of these are parents, children, and full-time workers or whatever. How do you structure your time? I mean, like, do you do little spurts and then go on, or did you have wide spots that nothing was written, or steadily plugging? I mean,
Massive amounts of amphetamines. No, I mean, I think Joyce Carol Oates said that one of the most necessary characteristics a writer needs is energy. And I'm a real morning guy. I'm a disgusting morning person. I mean, I get up very early, sometimes 4:30. And that's when the freshest hours of my day are those first 3 hours. When I'm really cooking and I have the time, it's 3 hours, some kind of break, 2 hours. But you have to have this, I'm a big believer in routine, you have to have this protected space and time. And it's really smart to stop when you're absolutely kicking it, so that the next day you pick up there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. My structure, for this book, it was a little bit different, I think. I had just left New York, and I was a senior broadcast producer, which meant putting the show on and the editorial direction and decisions were largely mine. So, I had a show that went on at the same time every day, and there are no excuses. I had a staff of writers and tape producers and correspondents. I don't know how many times they heard me say, what part about we go on the air in 3 minutes don't you understand in terms of getting me script? And this book was written, I actually wrote it in about 5 months while I was still working a full-time job, just because I think I still had that discipline of schedule and shut up and write. And that's pretty much the attitude I took. Now, I was on a panel once with a young woman, a lovely and talented woman by the name of Heidi Giroux, who was asked that question, and I think Heidi said it took her 10 years to write her book, her novel. And then the question came to me, and I said, well, I wrote mine essentially in 5 months. She actually kicked me under the table and leaned over and said, I hate you. Of course, as justice is a rather circular thing, Heidi's book is, I think, number 10 or 12 on the New York Times list, and mine's not.
Sir? Oh, sorry.
Batt, I remember reading about Ernie Pyle walking on the beach, and a small Bible apparently belonged to one of the soldiers. I remember reading that.
Yes.
He picked the Bible up, and he looked at it, and he put it back down. And then later he wrote he didn't know why he picked it up, and he didn't know why he put it back down.
Yeah, I remember that exact story. The one I think I was referring to was I think it's titled The Death of Captain Winslow, I believe was the captain's last name. And I would recommend any of you to look that one up. And I defy any one of you to read it and email me and say you didn't have a tear in your eye at the end of that one. Yes, ma'am.
Batt, I wanted to just say that I applaud your efforts to get your character, pardoned. What is it about the pardon and parole board in your state that might make this happen in the future when it didn't succeed this time? I don't know that much about that system.
The only thing I can say about that, and I'm not defaming my state too much, the fact that in the course of a century they couldn't see things a little bit differently. The process with the pardon and parole board is a pardon is always weighed, or parole is weighed heavily on the request or a letter of any surviving victim's family members, and I think that is what had a lot to do with this, and I can't argue with that. That's part of the process. I mean, this board had 6 people on it. I need 5 out of 6 votes to get it, and we'll try again, see what happens.
Adam, I have a question for you. 2-part question.
Oh, yes.
After 12 years with the same characters, were you just not tired of them by the time you published the book? And do you think that Sam Shepard was guilty?
Did everyone hear the question? Second question first. Like marriage, it depends on the day. I mean, there are days when there are so many holes in Shepard's testimony. And for those of you who, again, may not know much about the Shepard case, or if you knew about the Shepard case by way of The Fugitive, in The Fugitive, the Dr. Richard Kimball character is a white knight of marriage. Well, in fact, Dr. Sam Shepard was a bad guy. He was a serial philanderer. He carried on these affairs very much out in the open, as if, in a kind of game of marital brinksmanship, he was daring Marilyn to divorce him. Because Shepard's father, who was a very imperious guy, wouldn't grant him a divorce. And Shepard had an ongoing 3-year affair with Susan Hayes, a lab tech, a pathologist essentially, that he broke off mere months before he killed Marilyn, conveniently. On the other hand, there is a very suspicious character, Richard Eberling, who looked shockingly like Shepard, who not only had forensic evidence at the crime scene, but also had stolen Marilyn Shepard's wedding ring. And when he was brought in by police several years later, who questioned him about many petty thefts around Bay Village, Ohio, they said, "You know why you're here, don't you?" And Eberling said, "Look, I bled all over the Shepard house because I cut my finger that day while I was cleaning and just bled all over the room." They're like, "That's actually not why you're here." But in the tradition of Batt's parole board, they said, "Okay, well, you can go." Anyway, so
Was that in the
As for-
state of South Carolina?
as for 12 years, I mean, for me, writing Mr. Peanut is a series of intertwined narratives, and discovering the novel's structure was such an organic process that figuring out how to bind these different parts was, for me, an enduring challenge. And back to the earlier question, I was regularly interrupted. I was a journalist for years. And there's nothing like writing after doing some writing. And then I was a teacher. And God bless all the teachers of the world. Because I can just tell you that during the school year, I didn't get a lot of writing in. So the struggle for time was Herculean. So no, I didn't get bored because there was a lot to do and very little time to do it.
Yes.
This is for Adam. Just you mentioned just then all the different plots and stories in Mr. Peanut, and I was just wondering if you write it from beginning to end. You write different parts of it and then
I wrote, the question was, did I write Mr. Peanut in sequence? The answer is no. One of my heroes is Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian writer. Y'all may know him. His working method was he'd write his novels on index cards, and he had a shoebox. And he'd get inspired, and he'd write a passage, and he'd say, "Oh, that's sort of in the middle." And he'd put that scene in the middle of the shoebox. And then he'd say, "Oh, that's kind of the end," and he'd put it at the end. And so on. And then at the end, he would take out the index cards and write the connecting tissue. And so he'd rewrite the whole novel straight through. I really wrote it out of sequence. And again, this character appears throughout the novel, this Mobius character, who may or may not have killed the woman, Alice Pepin. And he became sort of the binding force of these disparate elements. And in the last year of drafting, I was made writer-in-residence of the school where I taught, and I had this huge whiteboard, and I had, you would have thought I was in business, because I had unbelievable outlines that I sort of consulted and figured out. So.
I just wanted to tell you, Adam, I thought you did such a great job from Alice's point of view.
Oh, thank you.
Because when I kept reading it, it said, I can't believe a man could write this and think what's in a woman's head. Kept looking back at your picture.
Thank you very much. Honestly, writing actually the parts of the novel I'm proudest of are when Marilyn Shepard takes over the novel, and I personally, my book of short stories, which comes out this summer, the last story is from a woman's point of view, and I find it very liberating.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, the bios that you had covered from when you were at ABC, right?
CBS.
CBS, one of the Bs.
It's all the same.
That you covered 9/11.
Hmm.
Is it, are you too close to it? Is it too soon? Is there not a nugget from that? I'm not even trying to ask this question. It's like, how do you write about that? Do you really need the perspective of time to do that? Just for yourself.
That's pretty interesting, and I'll give you kind of a short version of that. Be happy to talk more about it afterwards. But it was my broadcast that was on air that morning. So I started the coverage for CBS that day, and during the course of those first hours, I think that all of us were like. And certainly soldiers in combat is not a great metaphor because they face real death. But at that point, we went into a professional mode. We simply tried to get information on air. We tried to figure out what was going on as it was going on. And I don't think any of us stopped to think for a certain amount of time what was really going on. I had no real sense of it until I walked out of the building very late that day and saw a man with an automatic weapon on the streets of New York, which I had never seen and thought would never happen in America. And that is when it began to fizz on me. In terms of my own perspective, yeah, there's still stuff that I've probably got, we tend to do that, bottled up. But yes, I think that, yes, I'd like to go back to that at some point.